Hello there. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn program titled Lessons from Chantal. My name is Audrey Gentry, and I am the Education Manager at the Eno River Association. The goal for today's webinar is to help folks understand how Tropical Depression Chantal affected the Eno River and surrounding communities, why the damage happened the way that it did, and what is being done to build a more climate resilient future together. So before we jump in, I'll just mention that, if you're not familiar with the Eno River Association, we are a nonprofit land trust that has been around since the 1960s, and our mission is to protect the natural, cultural, and historical resources of the Eno River Basin. So if you're interested in learning more about our work, feel free to visit our website, enoriver.org, where you can learn more. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into today's program. So first, I want to talk about the life cycle of Chantal. So in late June of 2025, a cold front moved into the southeastern United States, and then it weakened, leaving behind what's called a decaying frontal boundary. It left that along the east coast, and that is a weather front that is weakening. It's losing its temperature contrast, and it's beginning to dissipate. Now, along this old front, an area of low pressure and clusters of thunderstorms persisted over very warm Western Atlantic waters, and this provided the fuel for possible tropical development. So the system rapidly organized into a tropical depression on July 4th over the Atlantic. On July 5th, it became better organized and was upgraded to tropical storm status, and that's when it received the name Chantal. It steadily intensified until it made landfall in South Carolina on July 6th, and then it again weakened into a tropical depression as it began to move inland later that day. So as it moved through North Carolina, it continued to produce heavy rainfall and flooding. And then it continued northeast. It produced some rainfall in the mid-Atlantic region, and then it dissipated by July 8th. So the top graphic here shows kind of a radar loop of Tropical Depression Chantal at landfall in South Carolina between July 5th and 6th. And then on the bottom, you can see its general path. And just in case you're not familiar with maps like this, the D on this map stands for tropical depression, and the L stands for low pressure or remnant low. So that's basically just another downgrade from tropical storm to tropical depression to remnant low. So you can see on this map that Chantal produced extreme rainfall across a narrow strip of central North Carolina between Raleigh and Greensboro. Alamance, Chatham, and Orange counties were the hardest hit, and then North Durham, as we know, was also heavily affected. So, one rain gauge north of Bynum, which is in Chatham County, reportedly hit over 14 inches, but the official maxima hover between like 8 and 11 and a half inches. And you can see those maxima on the in the table on the right. So, to put this in perspective a little bit, long-term climate data show that Orange and Durham counties average about 4 inches of rain for the entire month of July. And July, along with August, those are the two wettest months of the year. And those 4 inches of rain for the month of July are spread over roughly 10 wet days. So your typical precipitation events in this area during the month of July drop anywhere from like 0.1 to 0.5 inches, with occasional bigger systems reaching 1 inch or more. So that's obviously a huge difference compared to the numbers that we're seeing here in this table from Chantal. To compare to Hurricane Fran, so the RDU airport, which is like more South Durham, recorded around 8.8 inches of rain during Fran. And some nearby areas in Durham County reportedly received up to like 10 to 12 inches. Now, by the time Fran reached Durham, it had lost some strength and but it was still categorized as a hurricane. So it was producing strong winds in addition to the heavy rainfall. So it was a worse storm overall, as I'm sure you know, with a lot more damage that was more widespread in the state as opposed to the more kind of localized flooding of Chantal. So you can see in this graph, so this is a gauge height graph, water level graph of the Eno River, and the monitoring location is near West Point on the Eno. So you can see in this graph that the Eno reaches flood stage, which is about 20 feet, around 11 p.m. on July 6th, that Sunday. It reaches its peak around 26 feet just before 4 a.m. on July 7th, that Monday. It returns to flood stage on Monday around 5:30 in the evening and then continues to fall from there. So again, compared to Hurricane Fran, during Fran, the Eno flooded to just under 24 feet. So even though Fran was a worse storm overall, it is true that the Eno, the localized flooding that occurred in the Eno, it surpassed the levels that we saw during Fran. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the factors that led to the Eno flooding. So the first thing I want to note here is that flooding, including extreme flooding, is a natural part of a way that a river changes course over time. So this is something that I spoke to our land director, our new land director, Chris Dreps, about. And he was just talking about how rivers are not supposed to look the same forever, right? They're supposed to erode, they're supposed to flood, they're supposed to kind of change course a little bit and then even more over time. Now, on the other hand, we do know that climate change is making these flooding events occur more frequently. So that is something, of course, to consider and something we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But I did just want to note that, I think it's important to realize that like rivers aren't supposed to stay in the same place all the time, and flooding is to some extent a natural process. But for now, let's talk about the specific factors that led to the outcomes of this flooding event. So first, of course, Chantal itself produced rainfall that fell very intensely over a short period of time, about 12 hours total in the region. And this is going to contribute to flash flooding. Now, soil in the Eno River Basin is composed largely of clay, and clay tends to have slow permeability, poor drainage, rapid runoff. So once clay-rich soils become saturated, water does start to become runoff and run off of those soils. Additionally, the Eno watershed is small and it's pretty steep in some places. So together, the Eno and Little River watersheds are about 260 square miles, and the Eno is about 40 miles long, if you didn't know that. The river banks are especially steep in the upper Eno, and this is because the upper Eno is underlain by hard metamorphosed igneous rocks, and it's characterized by pretty fast-moving water. So, in this portion of the river, erosion has kind of deeply cut the rock into a relatively narrow V-shaped river valley. In the diagram on the top here, this is from a geologic adventure along the Eno River, which can be found online. The PDF of that can be found online. And you can see the difference between the upper and lower Eno in this diagram. So upper is like kind of above West Point and lower is below West Point. And so you can see that the upper Eno is underlain by these metamorphosed igneous rocks. The lower Eno is underlain by sedimentary rocks. And that accounts for some of that difference in how the water flows and the shape and the size of the channel. And then this is a photo on the bottom of Panther Branch, which is in the upper Eno. It's actually quite early on in the Eno. This is one of our preserves as the Eno River Association. And you can just kind of see some of the steeper banks here and the windiness of the river you can see here. So the sort of smaller size and the steepness in the upper Eno contributes to what is called flashiness, meaning that rainfall runs off quickly and rapidly it concentrates into the channel. So a steep, narrow watershed is going to lead to flashier rivers that reach flood stage sooner. Now, importantly, flashiness is also influenced by things like urbanization and development and the addition of hardscapes or impervious surfaces. If you're not familiar with those terms, it refers to surfaces that cannot absorb water, such as roofs, parking lots, roads, all of that. So despite a great deal of successful land protection along the Eno, it still is parts of it are still in pretty developed areas and there is a long history of land use along the river. So this certainly contributes to flashiness as well. And then finally, we know that rising global temperatures from human-caused climate change alter the water cycle, leading to more intense rainfall events. So warmer air holds more moisture. I found a statistic that for every 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, air can hold about 7% more water vapor. So more moisture in the atmosphere means that when conditions are just so, there are going to be heavier downpours when rain events do occur. So all in all, we're no longer talking about 100-year floods, right? We're talking about much more frequent flooding events as a result of a warming climate. So all of these things together that we see here on this page kind of came together um, and allowed Chantal to play out the way that it did. So I do want to take some time to talk about some of the affected communities, and this won't be, comprehensive, of course, of all the communities and folks that were affected. As far as I could tell, there's no single statewide official damage tally for like the state of North Carolina. We do know that Chantal caused more than 54 million in damage to homes, businesses, and public property in Orange County alone. And then we also know that 6 lives were lost across the state of North Carolina as a result of Chantal. In Durham, one of the hardest hit communities was the Old Farm neighborhood. This is a 470 home, predominantly Black neighborhood located off of Roxborough Road across from West Point on the Eno City Park. And a little background on Old Farm, it was established in the 1960s and the early 70s as a sort of like refuge for many Black families who were displaced as a result of urban renewal. And unfortunately, as a result of historical and persistent racism and structural inequities, people of color disproportionately reside in flood-prone areas at risk of damage from extreme storms. So during Chantal, nearly 80 individuals in Old Farm were evacuated by boat. Over 50 homes were flooded with water nearly reaching the ceiling in some homes. According to an article from the Ninth Street Journal, about 20 homes remain damaged today. And these are mostly folks who didn't have flood insurance. Only about 30% of Old Farm families did have flood insurance. And this, I won't get too into the nitty-gritty details here, but this is my understanding is that this is largely due to outdated floodplain maps that don't adequately account for all of the homes that should be listed as being in 100-year floodplain, which means those who likely should have been required to have flood insurance did not, because they did not know that they needed to. And that has left many folks sort of tied up in this bureaucratic red tape and essentially unable to repair their homes. So now I will talk a little bit about how the various parks and preserves along the Eno fared. There is a trail status dashboard on our website, enoriver.org, to check in on the status of trails because some still are closed, which we'll talk about a little bit. I'll first say that our amazing volunteer site stewards at our Eno River Association preserves began assessing trails within 2 days of the storm. So, although like volunteers weren't brought into Eno River State Park because of just like concerns about safety and the extent of the damage at the state park, we were very lucky to be able to um, allow our really well-trained and dedicated volunteer site stewards to help sort of assess the damage to our trails at our preserves. And according to Indigo Roper Edwards, our stewardship manager, he said that this dramatically increased the speed at which we were able to reopen trails within our preserve. So we were able to reopen in about 2 weeks after Chantal. And that includes mainly two public preserves, the Confluence Natural Area and Panther Branch Natural Area. So at these two preserves, there were extensive down trees and flood debris deposited on trails. You can see some of that in these photos. There were also a few benches and a picnic table that were washed downstream. Many of those were recovered, which is great. The tread and stability of the trails themselves at these preserves were largely intact. And this is in contrast to some trails at Eno River State Park, West Point, Penny's Bend, and certain sections of the MST, the Mountains to Sea Trail. So Indigo noted that this difference is largely due to more recent construction of all of the ERA preserve trails, which means that modern sustainable trail designs were taken into account when building the trails. And then they've also seen less wear and tear than a lot of those older trails that may have been around for many more years. So newer trails at Occoneechee Mountain, as well as sections of the MST that had restored vegetative buffers, those also saw much less damage than those older trails that I mentioned before, many of which are in the state park. They were built decades ago, were built very close to the river and perhaps on slopes with like insufficient support and infrastructure. So again, these are photos at the Confluence Natural Area taken in the days following Chantal. And then these are some photos of Panther Branch Natural Area, which is another one of our preserves in the Upper Eno, with some damage that occurred there. So now we're going to take a look at some photos that were taken by state park rangers who began assessing the damage within a few days of the storm. I want to begin with the caveat that we at the Eno River Association do not manage these trails. We work closely with the state park in a variety of ways, but they manage the state park and the trails within them, so we don't have control over how and when those trails get repaired. Sometimes we're in communication with the park and with the rangers about those things, but again, there's a distinction between the Eno River Association and Eno River State Park, and we at the Eno River Association don't have control over the status of those trails. And we'll talk a little bit more about the status of those trails and why some of them are taking longer to repair. So the suspension bridge and the Fuse Ford area. So the photo in the kind of right-hand top corner shows, of course, the sign, the Hurricane Fran sign, and this was kind of widely circulated, and it just very clearly shows that during Chantal, the water level of the Eno exceeded the previous record that Hurricane Fran had set. The swinging bridge at the Fuse Ford access sustained significant damage. It is not yet restored. And this means that all of the trails that require you to cross the swinging bridge, so Cox Mountain, Fanny's Ford, are closed until further notice. So the photos on the right-hand side of this slide show Coal Mill and Bobbitt's Hole trails, which sustained significant damage and are still closed to the public. In the center photo, you can see the Coal Mill Bridge on July 7th, and then you can also see photos of Pea Creek and Dunnigan trails on the far left. Pea Creek Trail runs under the Coal Mill Bridge, along with Laurel Bluffs on the other side, which is part of the MST, and the crossing under that bridge is completely washed out. So I believe that all of the trails within the section are still closed, but regardless, the crossing under that bridge is washed out, and so no one should try to cross that. And the state park is working with the North Carolina Department of Transportation to decide on next steps with regards to that crossing. The next photos show Pump Station, where you can see water up to or above a lot of the ruins. And a short stretch on Pump Station is open and can be hiked only as a loop from the Rivermont Road trailhead access at Pump Station. I don't have photos of this, but Holden Mill Trail on the riverside portion has been deemed unfixable, and it has to be moved away from the river. So a trail specialist will come in to help with that. The upland portion of Holden Mill is open, but that riverside portion is not open, and it will be some time before that can be rerouted. So I just want to say that park rangers, Friends of the Mountain Sea Trail, other community members and volunteer groups are working really hard to make repairs, but it is a long and complex process that unfortunately requires a lot of patience from both the people working on them and the people kind of on the outside and the people who want to enjoy those trails and those parks. So while some repairs may seem to be moving slowly to people looking from the outside, rangers and other folks are working continuously to fix what needs to be fixed while also maintaining all of the other, daily stewardship tasks that the park requires. There are permitting and review processes that have to be followed to ensure that, that sensitive species are not trampled by new trails, that new construction and repairs don't cause erosion or negatively impact water quality, and that rerouted trails will also be sustainable, and resilient in future flood events. So there's a lot to consider. And a lot of things that have to be going on at once when these repairs are being made to open back up to the public. And that's why it takes some time. So it's also, I wanted to note that, Chantal hit less than a year after Helene hit Western North Carolina. And although the damage that Chantal caused certainly should not be diminished, it was far less than what was sustained from Helene. So that disaster Helene sort of eclipsed Chantal when it comes to like funding priorities for the state, which also just adds to some of the difficulties of getting these repairs made. So next, we'll look at some photos showing flooding at West Point on the Eno on July 7th. So as you may know, we had just finished our festival for the Eno a few days prior, and there were still festival related things on site. We're grateful that we were able to get most everything out before the storm hit. West Point was closed for a few months following the storm. It's now open with restrictions for some areas, including parts of the lower park and river access points. I believe the bathrooms are still closed for repairs, but there are porta potties on site. And I'll also just say that as you may know, West Point is also undergoing significant renovations to make park-wide improvements, and that was planned before Chantal hit. So Hillsborough Riverwalk and the Occoneechee Replica Village. So Hillsborough Riverwalk is managed by the town of Hillsborough. But there was so we at Eno River Association are a little bit less involved with it, but there was extensive damage to Gold Park and Riverwalk, as well as to the Occoneechee Replica Village, which you can see in some of these photos that I think were taken like a few days after, I believe. You can see in the photo in the top right corner that the Bee Hotel in Gold Park was like lifted up and then moved and deposited under a Riverwalk boardwalk. And the village suffered a good amount of damage as well. At this point, several work days have taken place at the replica village, and they're making good progress with that. And Hillsborough Riverwalk and Gold Park are now open to the public. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, the flooding also caused some wastewater to be released into the Eno. So the Eno Creek Lift Station in Durham and the river pump station at the Hillsborough Wastewater Treatment Plant both failed and discharged untreated wastewater into the Eno. So, and that's in addition to some other sewage systems that overflowed as well. So there's no single number for exactly how much wastewater in total got into the Eno. But one pump station was reported to have released 5.8 million gallons of untreated wastewater into the river. Now, when wastewater spillages occur, it leads to higher bacteria levels, specifically fecal coliform, as well as some other bacteria levels. And that can carry health risks, such as like digestive infections, skin infections, and things like that. So, for that reason, we cautioned people to not get into the Eno for a while after the flooding to be safe. Toward the end of July, the Neuse riverkeeper, Samantha Kropp, she's pictured here on the left, sampled sites along the Eno to test for bacteria levels and determined that levels were safe enough for swimming at that point. But typically, following a major flooding event, it takes anywhere from a few days to a few weeks for water quality to kind of normalize. And healthy watersheds can make that process move a little faster. But even in cases where there hasn't been major flooding, it's best to wait a few days after a good rain before getting in the water. So turbidity, or the clarity of the water, how cloudy it is, can be a good metric to use for whether there is bacteria in the water. So if it's looking really cloudy, looking like chocolate milk, it's probably safe to assume that there may be some higher bacteria levels in the water as well, and to err on the side of caution and not swim in the river at that point. In terms of biodiversity impacts, plant and animal life impacts, there's no way of knowing exactly how greatly aquatic life and biodiversity was impacted by Chantal. There certainly would have been some mortality, right, with any sort of major weather event. Uh, but many aquatic organisms are adapted to handle flooding and would have been able to survive. So, crayfish and other macroinvertebrates, as well as some amphibians, may kind of burrow down in the sediment to protect themselves. Fish may find like side channels or more oxygenated areas to sort of hide out. They may hide behind like logs or other debris, and their bodies are sort of also like streamlined to withstand faster flows. In some cases, floods might actually benefit certain species. For example, some studies have shown that mayfly and stonefly nymphs benefit from what's called nutrient pulsing, and then also their gravel beds, like the gravel beds and rocks in the river are kind of cleaned of fine sediments that then go into the floodplain, right? And that can give them more nooks and crannies to use as habitat. And yeah, so resilient species, they may have an initial drop in population, but some may also have a large recovery soon after because of these changes to like habitat and nutrient levels. And of course, there's also, the consideration that with wastewater spillage, that's obviously not great for anybody. Again, resilient species and would have been able to survive that. I mean, it's happened before. Um, and some species are just able to survive, and others are not. And there's no way of knowing for sure how many animals, were killed as a result of Chantal, and there's no way to tell how many will like benefit from the changes that Chantal brought. Anecdotally, we do macroinvertebrate catching, just kind of informally, but we do that with our summer camps and kids, and we do it at a few different places along the Eno. And so I am interested to see in the coming months, this spring, like what we catch, what kinds of macroinvertebrates we catch. So next, I want to address the question, how much worse could it have been? And talk a little bit more about how past efforts did help to prevent more severe outcomes. Again, not wanting to, diminish the consequences of Chantal. But let's first answer the question, how does land protection increase climate resilience? So when land is protected from development, it keeps natural features like forests, grasslands, wetlands, floodplains all intact, and these ecosystems inherently mitigate effects of climate change in many ways. So let's use a forest, specifically a riparian buffer, as an example. So a healthy riparian buffer that exists between a river and a developed area is going to reduce flooding by intercepting and absorbing rainfall. It's going to protect water quality by filtering out pollutants and preventing erosion and sedimentation. It's going to support biodiversity, which in turn makes for a better functioning and healthier ecosystem. It's going to allow for carbon sequestration, which can help offset some greenhouse gas emissions, and more, right? So this is all in contrast to those hardscapes and impervious surfaces associated with development, which do the opposite of all of these things. So let's talk more about land protection in the Eno River watershed. Over the years, the Eno River Association and other community and government partners have protected about 8,000 acres of land in the Eno watershed. So that means about 23% of the watershed is under some form of protection. Our land director, Chris Dreps, did a quick calculation to estimate that protecting those 8,000 acres has probably prevented about 1,600 acres of rooftops, roads, and driveways from being built. Had those impervious surfaces and hardscapes been built instead of protected, it is undeniable that the flooding impacts would have been significantly worse, affected more people, more communities, and had greater impact on the river itself as well. It's also important to note that it's not just land protection efforts that prevented the flooding from being worse. So things like floodplain ordinances also played a big role, which can also make it easier for organizations like ours to protect land in floodplains. And when we do that, we're giving a river room to spread out during high flows and also room to move over time, which again is a natural ecological process. So this allows protecting floodplain land, allows a river to do what it needs to do without harming people and communities. And then it's also going to improve water quality, support biodiversity, and so on. So with all of that being said, there is definitely more work to do when it comes to minimizing damage done to people and communities and natural resources when another storm like this inevitably occurs. So I spoke with our land and stewardship team as well as our executive director, and I established a lot of sort of common themes and synthesized them into a list of considerations when it comes to next steps and where we kind of go from here. And I want to add a couple caveats that, first, while this list is tailored to our work as a land trust, much of it also can be, applied to local government agencies, community organizations, citizens, volunteers, other land trusts, and so on. So no single organization, of course, can do this work alone. There has to be collaboration across the entire community. And then I'll also say that we and other citizens and organizations have been doing a lot of this already, right? So this isn't a list of brand new ideas. These are things that have been in the works for many years. But certainly Chantal has kind of underscored their importance. So first on the list is protect vulnerable land. So continue working with partners to safeguard areas that are most at risk from flooding and development. So our land director gave a couple examples of some areas that would be good to consider for protection. So some lands along major tributaries of the Eno and Little Rivers, as well as lands within the lower Little River Valley. So there's more work to be done, right, with land protection. Next on the list is support local conservation investment. So support efforts by our local governments and citizens to invest in land protection. So there are some examples of programs here. These programs, if they're well funded, can work with us to make offers to landowners. And if they're not, they can make land protection work a lot more difficult. So organizations and community members can voice their support to state and federal representatives with regards to funding these and other conservation related programs. And that can be done, through voting, attending town halls, submitting public comments, supporting candidates who prioritize land and water conservation, and so on. Advocate for smart, responsible growth. So We can also be strong voices for citing growth outside of floodplains and other environmentally sensitive areas, while recognizing that land protection isn't and should not be the only tool that we have to keep communities safe. So, floodplain mapping, floodplain ordinances, other planning tools have been and should continue to be integral in mitigating climate risk as well. This is a conversation I had with our executive director, Ryan, or this kind of stems from that conversation. So, redefining restoration for a changing climate. So, sort of shifting away from trying to recreate or restore past landscapes and moving toward more adaptive management that anticipates new climate realities and embraces innovative approaches. So sometimes we, as a land trust or just as a society, might need to sort of reframe how we think about like the goals of restoration, traditional restoration. And then finally, embed climate resilience across all aspects of our work. So continue integrating resilience principles into all aspects of our work, from land protection to stewardship to education and outreach. So, for example, it's important that we build and or maintain trail systems that can better withstand flooding impacts while also protecting habitats and water quality. And then we at our organization can also expand upon our education programs with the goal of helping local residents and community members to better understand climate risk and climate impacts on our watershed and to help us take action to protect it. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, and I'll reiterate that, many organizations and community members, not just us, have been actively working on these efforts for many years, but still, Chantal really sort of underscored the importance of this work for us and reinforced the need to keep pushing forward and building upon these efforts. That's really all I have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to education@enoriver.org or association@enoriver.org. And you can also view this program on our YouTube channel, I Heart the Eno, at any time you wish. And if you'd like to get involved with volunteering, donating, just being on our email listserv, go to enoriver.org and go to the Get Involved page. Thanks so much for tuning in.